My pleasure. And yes, we're talking about the media, and where best to start with great African writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who has taken it upon himself, based on one of his books, Writers in Politics, has decided to write to a politician. And here we go. Open letter to his president, William Ruto. Okay, so this letter stems from him writing, William Ruto, on behalf of concerned Kenyans and also Africans alike. And, the writing clause. So he says, we begin. Dear William Ruto, the images of your recent visit to the US was very disturbing to me and to every patriotic Kenyan. I saw you seated on a chair grinning while Biden stood behind you, his face beaming with satisfaction. Why not? He had just announced that he has signed off our beloved Kenya to make it a non-member ally of NATO. In other words, you have agreed to become NATO's errand boy in America's struggle with Russia and China for access to resources of the continent. This part stood out to me. He then admonishes him, Ruto, do you know that NATO murdered Muammar Gaddafi so that Libyan oil fields, which Gaddafi had nationalized, would revert to the West? Gaddafi was once the chairman of the African Union, of which Kenya was a founding member. But this other picture was no less disturbing. While you were inside the White House, Haitians were in the street demonstrating, calling you a slave. Do you know the history of Haiti? Please read Black Jacobins, the book written by a once Jomo Kenyatta Pan-African ally, C.L.R. James. So, brother,
yes,
what's your take?
Of course, this stems from the recent visit of President William Ruto of Kenya to the White House. And of course, when an African leader is invited to the White House and is hosted with state dinner, and only perhaps a handful of African presidents have been so fitted in Washington by the President of the United States. It comes at one could say, a price or a cost. There's a famous saying in the United States, there's no free lunch, correct? So, the great author, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, is basically castigating, he's of course Kenyan, so I guess he would feel strongly about it, even if he was not Kenyan, because Ngugi is an international citizen of the world, Pan-African, a supporter of workers all over the world. So he's for the working people. So you talk about that image, of course, and I'm sure many listeners saw that photo,
the picture,
of Ngugi,
of William
Ruto sitting behind Biden's desk, where the United States president normally sits, with Biden standing behind him, while Ruto is seated. It's almost like a father image.
As if he came to bring your son to a work day.
Exactly. Here you go, son. And you cannot help but see the imagery that it could be seen as, here you go, boy. And that's what Google, of course, is also referring to. It says you're the Iran boy, of imperialism. Now, the question is this. Is it Ruto who asked to sit behind the desk? Or was it Biden that offered? Think about it. I find it highly unlikely that the President of the United States would say, Mr. President, would you like to sit for a second?
Oh my God.
But it's not unlikely that Ruto who of course wants to maximize the propaganda value around the world and in Africa and in Kenya in particular, that I have arrived. That said, Mr. President, could I sit behind there for a second? Because he knows the value of that full opportunity. So that's something that I haven't read anywhere. I don't know who asked who, but nevertheless, the point that Ngugi is making is very strong. And then it goes, of course, to the history. Why are you being co-opted in such a manner as a non-NATO member ally of the United States? Do you not know what NATO did? Do you know the murder of Gaddafi that we all watched, in real time? We actually watched live. The video was being streamed. It was being dragged. And, pretty much murdered before our eyes, right?
Yep, very much so.
And all because of the resources, which, by the way, they never got, because Libya is now a no-go zone. Nobody's benefiting from the oil that the West wanted. And then, of course, he's saying, don't you know that Haiti holds a special place in the history of all Africans? The first country in history where the enslaved African masses rose up and defeated their masters and declared an independent republic.
The Western Hemisphere.
You see? An achievement whose reverberation, of course, was heard in the United States, where millions of Africans were still enslaved. And of course, that lesson of Haiti, the enslavers, the slave masters in the United States did not want that example to spread. So even though Haiti right now has been reduced almost to its knees, it's not always been on its knees. So we must not just see our sister and brothers in Haiti and dismiss them as a so-called failed state. It is a so-called failed state by design. It proved that it could be master of its destiny.
True.
When they declared independence after defeating the French. So to see another Africa now being used, yes, of course, Haiti is chaotic. It's very unstable right now. But in Ngugi, like many of us suspect, that this is not about introducing stability in Haiti. Otherwise, why would not this be an African Union project where you have multiple countries contributing forces, right? Now you have one designated country, one designated leader, meaning it's easier to manipulate this intervention and to give instructions to one leader. So essentially saying you are acting as a proxy of the United States, because obviously with the past disastrous interventions, beginning of course in the early part of the 20th century, when the U.S. occupied Haiti and destroyed its economy, literally hijacked its national bank and constitution, So given that, the U.S. is very cautious about the optics, how it would look for another United States intervention. So many people suspect that this role has now been outsourced to William Ruto and Kenya, and that is what Brother Ngugi is lamenting.
So essentially, we now have a black face of imperialism in Africa, which gives us a very disturbing prospect. Not least
and that's
because,
what he's lamenting.
Yes.
Correct.
I mean, not least because the history of Kenya itself is laden with resistance.
Absolutely. And of course, and I'm glad you brought that point, The revolutionary history of Kenya is not as widely taught and not as widely familiar as the revolutionary history of the FNLA, for example, in Algeria. When in fact, one could say that the Algerians and other Africans that later fought national wars of liberation, like the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau, like the MPLA in Angola, Frelimo in Mozambique, the Patriotic Front,
even the ANC
of Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe, and the ANC as well, all took lessons from Kenya, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, which was, of course, denigrated as the so-called Mau Mau by the British. That was a really revolutionary act, where the Kenyans fought to recover the land that had been stolen by the British colonialists. So he's reminding, in that letter, he's reminding also William Ruto that even though you want us to forget that history, we can't forget that history. So in fact, Kenya has much in common with people that have fought wars of national liberation, and of course, Haiti
being
should
one
be
of
an example much earlier.
I mean, there's a book I'd like to read from, Not Yet Uhuru by Oginga Odinga, who was one of the foremost liberation leaders in Kenya.
A socialist leader.
Yes.
And I think it was Kenya's first vice president.
Before he jumped ship, obviously frustrated with the path that was followed by Jomo Kenyatta.
Correct.
And it's the foreword to his book, Not Yet Uhuru. Not Yet Uhuru. The foreword is actually written by none other than Kwame Nkrumah, who himself was the first head of state of Ghana. And I'll quickly read just a very short paragraph. It was in order to eradicate completely foreign rule and domination from Africa, to fortify the continent against the turbulent world of power politics, that we bent our concerted effort towards unity. It is in this sense that I consider the establishment of the OAU as an important step forward, which is what Ngugi is alluding to there. And I will end with this part. He said, although political independence is a noble achievement in the struggle against colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism, its effectiveness is superficial unless economic and cultural independence is also achieved. The road to the attainment of economic, cultural independence is beset with neocolonialism, which is becoming even more menacing to its newly independent states than orthodox colonialism. So essentially, Ngugi, with this letter, is warning us that the problem is still very much real. And we're talking about 60 or plus years. And we're still having to contend with the issue that the problem now is, as my people would say in Yoruba, which is the germ that besets the greens actually lives on the green itself. So the problem is the country itself is hosting its own problem. You've got a leader here who doesn't quite understand his position in the world, and instead he's hawking himself around for validation, the validation you've already have with your people. So any last words on that?
Well, I mean, a number of points. I think, sadly, we as African people, or any other formerly colonized people all over the world, we were miseducated. Independence, or Uhuru, was an end in of itself, which of course is incorrect. Decolonization is a process, and political independence is just one aspect of decolonization. So we have to remind our sisters and brothers in Africa or formerly colonized parts of the world, that we are still trying to decolonize. We're living in a process of decolonization, right? We still don't control our sovereignty.
Yeah.
We don't control our resources. And even our minds, as you saw, as you can say, Ruto is a brilliant example of a mind that has not yet been sufficiently decolonized. Could you imagine Mwalimu Julius Nyerere sitting behind Biden's desk with Biden standing behind him? Or any American president desk
No.
with the American president standing behind him? Just try to picture that image.
I can't
Could you
even.
imagine Kwame Nkrumah agreeing to do something like that? Even Jomo Kenyatta, who, of course, you could say had nationalist credentials and then turned into the epitome of the bourgeois state and bourgeois leader. I can't even imagine Jomo Kenyatta doing that. And let's even select the most reactionary of African presidents from the 1960s and 70s, Mobutu. I can't imagine even Mobutu doing that. I think Mobutu would be cautious enough to see how this would play out, the optics, right?
Of course,
and
of
say,
course,
no,
of course. Of course.
you know,
Of course.
Mobutu, this reactionary thief, the assassin of Patrice Lumumba. I don't think so. And that's why the more I'm talking about it, the more I think that the idea did not come from Biden. I think the
idea was his.
Probably came from President Ruto himself.